Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So what I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is one of the things that is important to understand and interesting to understand when it comes to universal common descent of life on Earth, right, is that it really is universal, all life on Earth, right? So I've made a lot of videos, right, talking about universal common descent and talking about how exactly it is that we know that all life on Earth is related through common descent, right? We see reproductive dependencies, right? For one thing, right, like how uh, a baby human, for example, right, needs the mother's womb, right, needs the mother's body to grow and develop, right? And we see these reproductive dependencies shared between groups in nested hierarchical patterns, right? And we see, and also with the reproductive dependencies, we see that it goes all the way down to the cellular level, right? We see that because we see that it's much easier to make new organisms from modifying already existing organisms than to make them totally from scratch, right? The only synthetic life, right, that has ever been made in the lab, right? The only synthetic life that has ever been made in the lab, right, used already existing life, right? It used host cells, right? No person has ever in the lab, right, designed an organism just from scratch, right? Nor does anyone have any idea how to, right? So it is far easier to make living things from already existing living things. And okay, that also what we also observe, right, with the diversity of life on Earth, right, is that it goes vastly beyond what is practically necessary, right? So we observe, right, for example, that a bat, right, a bat flies, a bird flies, right? If it was all up to practicality, right, you would think that if anything else, that a bat would share the most similar anatomy to a bird, right? And yet, in every system of its body, it's far more similar to a camel, to a dog, to an elephant, to a human, to a chimpanzee, to other mammals, right, than it is to a bird, right? Whether it be its reproductive system, immune system, integumentary system, skeletal system, even a skeletal system, its nervous system, digestive system, circulatory system, etc., right? It is all more similar to other mammals and in predictable ways, right? And so we see, right, that the diversity, right, of life goes way beyond what is necessary, right? The whole differences between mammal versus bird, right? It goes beyond, way beyond what is practically necessary, and yet in nested hierarchical patterns, right? Groups within groups within groups, right? Like mammal, tetrapod, vertebrate, right? And we observe that these patterns go all the way down to the molecular level, right? And so these patterns are exclusively consistent with universal common descent of life on Earth, right? And so in any event, though, what's an important thing to understand with universal common ancestry of life on Earth is that it really is universal. It's not just all mammals, it's not just all tetrapods, it's not just all vertebrates, it's not even just all animals, it's all life, right? Even a tree in your backyard, right, shares common ancestry with you, right? But what's important to understand with the shared ancestry that we have with like plants and fungi, what's important to understand with that part of what will get people confused by, when it gets to that extent is that the multicellular structures of animals, right, compared to plants, right, or fungi are fundamentally distinct in certain ways, right? And part of what will get people confused about it is that they'll think that the last shared ancestor between us and them must have also been multicellular, just like how we're multicellular and they are, but it actually wasn't, right? Our lineages evolved multicellularity independently, right? Which is an example of what we would call convergent evolution, right? When lineages, due to similar evolutionary pressures, or not even always similar, it could be different, right? But they go down analogous paths, right? There are examples of that. And so in the case of fungi and plants, right, they evolved multicellularity independently of us, right? Both us and them, right? We all trace back originally to single-celled organisms, right? Our ancestors evolved multicellularity, but they eventually trace back to single-celled organisms, right? Which, by the way, is not as mysterious of a transition as some would think it is or would make it out to be. Believe it or not, evolution of multicellularity from single-celled organisms has actually been observed to occur in the present. There are papers you can read about this de novo origin of multicellularity in the lab. Look it up. There are papers on this. It's actually been observed to occur in the present, literally observed in real time, right? And so it is not as mysterious as a transition as someone would think that it is. But it does not have to be like a one-time event that like, oh, only one group could ever go down that way. Other groups can also evolve in that way independently, right? And so in any event, in the case of animals and fungi and plants, each of those groups independently evolved multicellularity. And so the most recent shared ancestors between these groups were single-celled organisms reproducing through some of the mechanisms through of which single-celled organisms reproduce through, right? And okay, I can also tell you how it is that we know that these groups independently evolved multicellularity, right? How would we know that it was evolved separately versus if the last shared ancestor was multicellular? One thing is, like I said, fundamental differences of our multicellular setup, right? But also, really the biggest way we know that, right, is based on our understanding of which groups are most closely related to each other, right? Acquired in this case mainly through molecular evidence, right? Molecular evidence actually indicates that, for one thing, fungi are closer related to animals, and likewise animals to fungi, than either is to plants, right? But not only that, even in between us and fungi, molecular evidence would indicate that a number of other groups are closer related to us than closer related to animals than even like animals as a whole, including us, than fungi are. Many of which are single-celled, right? the majority of which actually are single-celled, right? And also, likewise, molecular evidence would indicate that a number of single-celled groups of single-celled organisms are closer related to plants, right, than they are to fungi or animals, right? And so, therefore, indicating, right, that these lineages, and while also worth noting that we observe nested hierarchical patterns of these, share, down to the molecular level, which groups share, like, genetic sequences with each other, right, share genes in common. And so in any event, right, these groups evolve multicellularity independently, right? And so the most recent shared ancestors between them were single-celled organisms reproducing through the types of means that a single-celled organism can reproduce through. It's not all the same, granted. I'm not saying that, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's all the same, right? But reproducing through, reproducing down at that level, reproducing as single-celled organisms, no multicellular, we obviously have multicellular reproductive structures, right? Like penis, vagina, all of that. But the last shared common ancestor between us and plants, it was no multicellular structures like that. It was only cellular mechanisms of reproduction, right? But the last shared ancestor with us and them still was most likely still capable of sexual reproduction, just as many species of single-celled organisms still are today, right? So the simplest forms of sexual reproduction we see are in single-celled organisms. There are single-celled species capable of sexual reproduction, right? And so the earliest origin of sexual reproduction, right, was started in single-celled organisms, right, before there were any more advanced multicellular methods, right, like with penis, vagina, all of that. I've made other videos breaking that down, the evolution of the reproductive system. You can find it on my playlist, Evolutionary Reducibility of Biological Systems. You can find videos I've done on that. But in any event, right, the ability to reproduce sexually goes all the way back to early eukaryotes, right, which is the group that includes all organisms with eukaryotic cells, right, meaning cells that contain a nucleus, right, as opposed to a nucleoid like we see in other groups like bacteria and archaea. But we also ultimately, by the way, if you trace it back even further, we eventually branch back to common ancestry even with bacteria, archaea, even them, literally all life on Earth, every living organism, we trace back to common ancestry with, right? But the mechanisms of descent, right, the mechanisms of, like ancestor and descendant, right, are more and more different the further back, right? Eventually getting down to single-celled mechanisms, eventually getting back to prokaryotic mechanisms, right? Not even having a nucleus, right? And so, also worth noting, by the way, with understanding the evolution of multicellularity, like I said, it's not as mysterious as a transition as some would think. It's actually been observed in the present, right? But also what's important to understand with that is it does not have to be like an abrupt transition from single cell to human, for example. There's still many more steps down the way, obviously, right? Like mammal, tetrapod, vertebrate, all the groups of primates we're a part of even before you get to mammal, etc. I've done other videos on it. I can break down the major steps that we know of. I have on other videos, right? And not only does it not even have to start out as human, but it does not even have to start out with organs or even tissues. The simplest animals alive today, sponges and protozoans, yes, they are multicellular, but they have no organs, right? Zero organs, and not even any tissues, right? And so the earliest form of multicellularity in the earliest animals, it does not have to abruptly go from single-celled to something with organs. There's intermediate stages, right? Single-celled to multicellular, but still having no organs, not even any tissues, eventually progressing to organs, right, which become more and more specialized across generations as our ancestors adapted over time, right? And so in any event, but like I said, right, with understanding universal common descent, that it even goes to bacteria, right? Like I said, the reproductive dependencies organisms have in being produced go all the way down to the cellular level, right? It's far easier to make an organism from already existing organisms than totally from scratch, right? And all the way down to the cellular level, we see nested hierarchical patterns, right? At the molecular level, right? Which ultimately include all of life on Earth, right? And so these patterns that we observe, right, strongly align with universal common descent of life on Earth. And so, and well, also, by the way, we also get fossil evidence of this as well, right? Because there are dating methods for dating the order of different fossils that we find, that paleontologists find, right? And based on these dating methods, right, we see that all of the earliest life not only was single-celled, was prokaryotic, right? So not eukaryotic cells, prokaryotic, right? And so that is another line of evidence in regards to this as well, right? Well, and also not only is that what all of the first of it is, it goes on that way for a long amount of time before you get anything else, right? A very large amount of time. Actually probably more than half of the whole history of life on Earth, right? That it was not just single cell, but prokaryotic, right? For billions of years like that before you get anything else. So, all right, that's all for now. See you guys.